The microphone went dead in my hand. Not slowly, not with a crackle or a warning. 1 second I was speaking, and the next, my voice was simply gone. The council chamber stretched out before me, a vast, curved hall carved from pale mineral stone, lit by soft violet panels running along the ceiling. 140 delegations sat in their tiered seats, and every single one of them was laughing. Not politely. Not quietly. They were laughing the way beings laugh when they have already decided the outcome and the proceedings are just a formality. I am Ambassador Yara Osei. I have represented Earth at the Galactic Covenant Council for 3 years. Before that, I spent 9 years in diplomatic service across 4 continents on my own planet. I have sat across negotiating tables from people who wanted to end wars, people who wanted to start them, and people who could not tell the difference. I have never, in all of that time, felt the particular coldness that settled into my chest in that moment, standing at a podium, holding a dead microphone, 8 billion people behind me, and the laughter of the galaxy ringing off polished stone walls. The session had begun 2 hours earlier. The Vethra Combine, a block of 3 elder species who had been members of the Covenant for over 4 centuries, had introduced Resolution 7 Alpha 9. The document was long, technical, and almost boring in the way it was written. Bureaucratic language has a way of making devastating things sound administrative. The resolution proposed to reclassify Earth as a protected primitive world. In practice, that meant stripping us of our voting rights, our independent trade licenses, our right to maintain any fleet beyond a handful of observation vessels, and our seat on any covenant committee. We would remain members in name, the way a child is a member of a household, with no voice, no authority, and no agency over decisions that affected our own planet. I had known it was coming. Our intelligence networks, which, to be fair, the Covenant had always underestimated, had picked up the early signals 3 weeks before the session. The filing of the resolution had been accompanied by a package of supporting evidence that the Vethra had distributed to all member delegations 24 hours in advance, ensuring that every species in that hall had already read it before I arrived. The evidence was damning. It was also not entirely real. Casualty statistics from human conflicts going back 2 centuries, presented without context. Environmental damage indices that deliberately excluded our recovery programs. A study, attributed to 3 different research institutions, that claimed human genetics carried measurable markers of what they called instinctive territorial aggression, as though that was unique to us, as though every species that had ever built a civilization had not fought for the ground beneath their feet. The data was curated like a painting. Every brushstroke was technically sourced. The picture it created was a lie. I had prepared a 40-minute response. I had charts. I had counter-citations. I had testimony from 6 independent scientific bodies that had reviewed the Vethra's genetic study and found it methodologically wrong in 11 specific ways. The council granted me 40 seconds. Council President Vel Dorith, a tall, silver-scaled Vethra himself, had informed me of the time limit with a tone that suggested he was being generous. I stepped to the podium. I drew a breath. I began to speak. At 17 seconds, the microphone was cut. I kept talking. My voice carried into the first few rows by sheer force of habit, but the chamber's acoustics were designed to funnel amplified sound, not unamplified human speech. The laughter began somewhere in the middle tiers, I never identified which delegation started it, and spread outward like a slow wave. Vel Dorith made no effort to restore the microphone. He sat in his elevated chair with the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed this scene in private and was now watching it perform exactly as expected. I stood there for 11 more seconds. I know the exact number because I counted them. I had nothing else to do. Then I set the microphone down on the podium, gently, deliberately, without a sound, and I walked back to the Earth delegation table. The vote was 97 in favor, 11 against, and 32 abstentions. Resolution 7 Alpha 9 passed with overwhelming majority. Earth was reclassified before I had finished pouring a glass of water. The holographic display above the chamber updated in real time, cycling through the amendment language. There was a soft tone, the Council's standard signal for a passed resolution, and then the session moved on to Agenda Item 4, which was a border dispute between 2 species I had never heard of on the far edge of the outer arm. My access badge deactivated 12 minutes later, while I was still sitting at the table. I noticed because the small status light on the badge, green since the day I had arrived, shifted to amber. I pressed my thumb to the verification panel. It flashed once and went dark. I was still physically in the chamber, in the seat I had occupied for 3 years, and I was already no longer recognized as being there. I gathered my documents quietly. I nodded to the 2 junior diplomats who had come with me, Lynn Harvey and Peter Okafor, and we left without making a scene. I heard the chamber continuing behind us, procedural language, a vote on the border dispute, another soft tone, until the heavy doors closed and cut it all away. The corridor outside was long and cool. The walls were the same pale mineral stone as the chamber, and the lighting was softer here, more amber than violet. We walked without speaking until we reached the transit bay where our shuttle was docked. Peter was the first to break the silence. He was 26, the youngest member of my team, and he had joined the diplomatic service because he genuinely believed in the idea of cooperation between civilizations. He had believed in it every day for the 2 years he had worked with me. I watched his face on the walk back and could see the moment that belief started to crack. "What do we do?" he said. Lynn did not look up from the document pad she was already working on. She was 34, methodical, and she had been in diplomatic service for a decade before she joined my team. She understood the machinery of international, and now intergalactic, institutions with the precision of someone who had spent years watching them malfunction. "Ambassador," Peter said again. I stepped into the shuttle. Sat down. Pulled up my communication terminal. Not the official Covenant-linked channel, that would flag immediately. The secondary channel, which ran on Earth's own relay infrastructure, the one we had been quietly maintaining for 5 years for exactly the kind of situation where official channels became unreliable. I made one call. Not to the Secretary General, whose office would need hours to process what had happened and organize a response. Not to the coalition of nations whose foreign ministers were already, I was certain, waking up to the news on feeds they did not yet understand. I called a man named George Adler, who held a title that did not appear on any public government roster and who had, for the past 6 years, been running a project that the Covenant did not know existed. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, I looked out the viewport at the station outside. It was a massive structure, the Covenant Central Hub, built by species that had been traveling between stars before humans had discovered agriculture. It glittered against the dark, beautiful and confident in the way that things built by the powerful always are. I thought about the laughter. I thought about the 40 seconds. I thought about Vel Dorith sitting in his elevated chair, perfectly still, watching everything happen exactly as he had planned. I pulled out my personal notebook, paper, actual paper, which every alien diplomat who had ever seen it found charmingly primitive, and I wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. No petitions. Then I started writing numbers. The shuttle lifted away from the station. Earth's blue and white curve was visible from the port window, small enough to fit behind my thumbnail if I held my hand up to the glass. I had stood in front of that view 100 times and felt something that I could never quite name, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the throat. This time I did not feel that. This time I felt clear. I felt precise. I felt the particular focus that only arrives when every option except one has been removed from the table. They had not understood what they were doing when they cut that microphone. They had not simply silenced one diplomat. They had removed the restraint. Because as long as I was standing at that podium, I was representing Earth through official channels, bound by procedure, by protocol, by the measured language of international diplomacy. As long as I had a seat at that table, I had reason to use it carefully. The microphone was dead. The badge was dark. The seat was taken away. And so the careful language went with it. Lynn looked up from her document pad. "You called Adler," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Then it has already started." "Yes," I said again. Peter was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was very steady for someone whose hands were visibly shaking, "Are we going to be okay?" I looked at Earth through the window. Small, blue, patient, and absolutely full of people who had been told for 11 years that they were the newest and least important members of a community that had never truly welcomed them. "We are going to be fine," I said. "It is everyone else who should be thinking carefully right now." I did not cry. I calculated. The recording of the session was on Earth's public feeds within 7 minutes of the shuttle leaving the station dock. I did not release it. I did not stop it, either. Lynn had, very carefully, not closed the secure uplink before my badge went dark, and the feed had been running continuously for the entire session. It was raw, unedited, and in the original Galactic Standard audio, which our translation networks converted into 63 human languages within 4 minutes of upload. 7 minutes. That was how long it took. By the time our shuttle broke through the outer atmosphere and began its descent toward Nairobi, where the Earth Diplomatic Coordination Center was based, the feeds had already generated more responses than any single event in recorded human history. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. It is a precise measurement. Lynn tracked it on her pad during the landing approach and read me the numbers in a flat voice that suggested she was trying very hard to treat them as simple data. Peter sat with his hands folded in his lap and said nothing at all. The coordination center was lit from top to bottom when we arrived. It was past midnight in Nairobi, but every floor of the building was running at full capacity. I had sent one message ahead: no public statement until I am in the room. To their credit, the team had held. The Secretary General's office had been calling every 4 minutes. 2 heads of state had reached the center's emergency line. 14 coalition governments had filed formal requests for a joint briefing. Nobody had said anything publicly. They had waited. I walked into the main briefing room at 12:41 in the morning and found 19 people sitting around the table, all of them quiet, all of them looking at me with the particular expression that people wear when they have been told something world-altering and have not yet processed what it means. The Secretary General herself was at the head of the table. Eleanor Graves was 61 years old, a former economist, and the kind of person who communicated more in silence than most people did in speeches. She looked at me for a long moment when I entered. "Tell me where we are," she said. I sat down. I opened my notebook to the page with the 2 words on it. I turned it so she could read them. She looked at the page. She looked at me. "All right," she said. And then she turned to the room. "Everybody who does not have a level 4 clearance needs to leave now." 8 people left. 11 stayed. I began to talk. The next 4 hours were some of the most technically dense of my career. This was not a conversation about anger or principle or what the Vethra had done wrong. Those conversations would come later, in speeches, in press statements, in the long public reckoning that I could already see building on the feeds outside the window. This conversation was logistics. Treaty withdrawal is not a simple procedure. The Covenant's membership framework had been designed, very deliberately, to make exit difficult. There were notice periods, dispute resolution requirements, financial settlements for infrastructure use, binding arbitration clauses that could drag proceedings out for years. The Vethra, who had helped write many of these clauses, clearly expected them to function as a cage. If Earth tried to leave formally through the Covenant's own procedures, it would take between 3 and 7 years, during which we would remain classified as a primitive world with no rights and no voice. We were not going to use the Covenant's procedures. George Adler had joined the call remotely from a facility that I am not going to describe in detail. He was 63, quiet in the way that people who carry large plans tend to be quiet, and he had spent the last 6 years building something that nobody outside a very small room had known was being built. "How ready are you?" I asked him. "We activated the first stage at 22:11, he said. "The platforms are already shifting configuration." Lynn sucked in a breath. Even she had not known the precise timeline. Eleanor leaned forward. "What are we talking about, specifically?" Adler shared his screen. What appeared was a network diagram, not the Covenant's communications grid, which every species in the galaxy used and which had given the Covenant enormous leverage over interstellar contact for centuries. What appeared was something parallel. Something built quietly, one node at a time, in the margins of our publicly declared space infrastructure. Relay stations disguised as mining survey platforms. Signal amplifiers nested inside weather observation satellites. A web of connectivity that had been growing, undetected, for 6 years. "We can activate the full network in stages," Adler said. "The first stage, which is already running, covers Earth's solar system and the 14 closest inhabited systems. The second stage covers the outer arm relay chain. Full activation, the whole network, can be online within 72 hours. The room was very quiet. "Does it work?" Eleanor said. "We have been testing it for 2 years, Adler said. "Yes. It works." I looked at the network diagram for a moment. Then I said, "Who else knows this exists?" 11 people in this room, plus 4 technicians at the activation site, Adler said. "And as of about 40 minutes ago, 3 governments who reached out through back channels after seeing the council footage." "Which 3?" Eleanor asked. He named them. Two were small, independent civilizations who had never quite fit into the Covenant's structure, too distant, too different, too consistently outvoted to matter. The third was a mid-sized species called the Keth, who had 11 seats in the Covenant and had been, I noted, one of the 11 who voted against Resolution 7 Alpha 9. They want to talk, Adler said. Tell them we are available tomorrow morning, I said. After the withdrawal announcement. Eleanor looked at me. You want to make the announcement before we have secured any allies? I want to make the announcement before the Covenant has time to build a narrative around our silence, I said. Right now, every species in the galaxy is watching their feeds. They saw what happened in that chamber. They are waiting to see what Earth does. If we wait 3 days and negotiate quietly first, we look like we are asking for help. If we announce first and negotiate second, we look like we know exactly what we are doing. She thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Eleanor Graves did not deliberate slowly. Write the statement, she said. It took 40 minutes to draft. I wrote the first version, Lynn edited it for legal precision, and the Secretary General changed 3 words. The final text was clean and direct. It did not contain a single word of anger, though I confess the first draft had a few. The statement noted the events of the council session. It noted that the resolution had passed on the basis of evidence that Earth formally contested. It noted that Earth had, for 11 years, operated in good faith within the Covenant's framework. And then, in language that was so simple that any species with access to a translation matrix could understand it without ambiguity, it stated that the United Earth was immediately and fully withdrawing from all Galactic Covenant treaty obligations. Effective upon transmission of the notice, Earth would no longer consider itself bound by Covenant trade regulations, territorial accords, communications protocols, or any other framework document bearing the Covenant seal. We were not filing an appeal. We were not requesting a reconciliation session. We were not asking for anything. We were simply leaving, and saying so clearly. The statement was transmitted at 4:52 in the morning, Nairobi time. It went out through Earth Standard Diplomatic Channel to every Covenant member delegation simultaneously. It also went, through Adler's network, to the 3 species who had reached out through back channels. And it went, Lynn handled this part personally, to every public news feed on Earth and to 17 independent alien media networks that operated outside Covenant oversight. By 5:15, the Covenant's response channel was generating traffic that our monitoring systems described as unprecedented volume. The Vethra Combine's diplomatic office sent 3 messages in the first 20 minutes. The first was formal and procedural, referencing the Covenant's exit process requirements. The second was less formal. The third was a single line. This is an emotional response. Please reconsider. I read all 3 and set them aside. At 5:41, the Keth ambassador contacted us directly. Not through Covenant channels, through Adler's network, which the Keth had apparently been exploring for the past 30 minutes with considerable interest. His name was Tor Nevin. He was low-voiced, deliberate, and he had the look of someone who had spent years being the right answer in the wrong room. Ambassador Osei, he said. I voted against the resolution. I know, I said. Thank you. I did not expect it to pass so easily, he said. Neither did I admitted. Though I should have. What are you building, he said, and he glanced, very deliberately, at the network schematic still visible on the screen behind me. I considered him for a moment. Something better, I said. There was a long pause on his end. Then, we would like to be part of that conversation. Tomorrow morning, I said. We will send coordinates. I ended the call and looked at Lynn. She was already updating the meeting schedule. Outside the window, Nairobi was beginning to lighten. The sun was coming, slow and orange, over the edge of the city. Inside the building, phones were ringing and keyboards were running and 23 separate governments were trying to reach us at once. The Covenant thought removing our seat at the table would silence us. They forgot that we built things. Quietly, carefully, without asking permission. They forgot that humans, when they are told they are not welcome somewhere, do not spend long standing at the door. They go and build a door of their own. The morning was ours, and we had work to do. The Council's emergency session was called at 9 in the morning, Galactic Standard Time, which translated to just before noon in Nairobi. They scheduled it without sending us an invitation. The assumption, apparently, was that Earth, having had its official access revoked, would simply not attend. I attended. Not through any Covenant channel. Tor Nevin's office sent me a guest observer code, which was technically valid under a 200-year-old covenant clause that allowed member species to bring non-member witnesses to open sessions. The clause had been used 3 times in recorded covenant history, always in cases involving species who had not yet achieved membership, never in a case involving a species that had chosen to leave. The legal office of the covenant would later argue that the clause did not apply to our situation. They would make that argument after the session. Not before it. I walked into the chamber at 11:58. Lynn came with me. Peter stayed at the coordination center, where he was managing incoming communications at a rate that he had described, with commendable understatement, as significant. I did not go to the observers' gallery. The observers' gallery was a raised tier at the back of the chamber, separated from the main floor by a railing and a noticeable difference in seat quality. It was where primitive worlds and pre-member civilizations sat when they were invited to watch proceedings that did not concern them. I walked to the main floor. I walked to the Earth delegation table, my table, the one I had sat at for 3 years, and I set down my notebook, my water glass, and a small thermos of coffee that Lynn had made before we left the center. I pulled out the chair and I sat down. The chamber was not yet full. Delegations were still filing in. Several of them stopped when they saw me. I noted their expressions with professional interest and looked down at my notebook. Council President Vel Dorith arrived at 12:04. He was already speaking to an aide when he entered, and his attention did not reach the Earth table immediately. It reached it when he sat down and glanced across the floor and found me looking back at him. The silence that spread out from that moment was something I felt physically. It moved through the room in a wave, delegation by delegation, until the entire chamber was quiet in a way it had not been since the last time a quorum vote had failed. Vel Dorith said something I could not hear. His microphone was not yet active, to the aide beside him. Then he activated his channel and spoke. Ambassador Osei, his voice was very measured. You are in a restricted area. The Earth delegation's floor access was revoked with the passing of Resolution 7 Alpha 9. That is an interesting point, I said. Under which treaty? A pause. A very specific kind of pause, the kind that happens when someone has walked confidently into a room and found the furniture moved. The Covenant membership framework governs floor access, Vel Dorith said. Yes, I said. And Earth is no longer a signatory to the Covenant membership framework. We transmitted formal withdrawal notification at 4:52 this morning. So I would be grateful if you could identify the specific legal instrument under which the framework now applies to Earth, given that we are no longer bound by it. Another pause. This one longer. You cannot withdraw in this manner, Vel Dorith said. The exit process requires formal arbitration proceedings. The arbitration requirement is Clause 44 of the Covenant membership framework, I said, which Earth, as of this morning, does not recognize as binding. I am happy to work through the specific legal questions in detail, if you have time. Though I notice we are interrupting an emergency session that you called without notifying us, which is itself an interesting procedural choice. The chamber had a particular kind of quiet now. Not the laughing quiet of yesterday. A different kind. Attentive. Uncertain. I could feel the shifts in posture in the tiers above me without looking up. Lynn, beside me, had her document pad open and was not looking at anything except the screen, which meant she was listening to everything. Vel Dorith leaned slightly forward. What is it that Earth actually wants from this session? Nothing, I said. I made sure my voice was pleasant. We didn't call this session. You did. I came because I was invited by Ambassador Nevin under Observer Clause 14C. If you would prefer I leave, you are welcome to formally request it through Ambassador Nevin's office and they can review whether Clause 14C permits that. Vel Dorith did not ask me to leave. I poured coffee from my thermos into the small cup I had brought. The sound of liquid pouring was, in that silence, remarkably audible. The emergency session proceeded. What unfolded in the next 90 minutes was less a debate than a very public reckoning. The Vethra Combine had called the session to address what their materials described as Earth's unauthorized withdrawal action, their intention being, clearly, to have the Council issue a formal censure and establish that Earth's withdrawal was not legally valid. They had prepared a detailed argument. What they had not prepared for was the Keth. Tor Nevin took the floor at 12:22 and spoke for 14 minutes. He was measured, precise, and meticulous in the way that species who have been outvoted for decades learn to be when they finally see an opening. He noted that the evidence package submitted with Resolution 7 Alpha 9 contained a genetic study attributed to the Vethra Research Foundation that had been independently reviewed by 3 external scientific bodies, he named them, with citation codes, and found to be statistically compromised in 11 specific ways. He noted that 2 of those bodies had submitted formal review requests to the Covenant's Scientific Committee 14 months ago. He noted that those requests had not been acted upon. He then noted that Earth's formal withdrawal, whatever procedural questions it raised, had been accompanied by a public counter-evidence package that was now available on every major feed in the galaxy, and that 740 million individual beings across 17 species had already accessed it. Vel Dorith interrupted twice. Nevin cited clause and subsection both times and continued. When Nevin finished, I was asked if I wished to speak. I said yes. I spoke for 6 minutes. I did not raise my voice once. I outlined what Earth had done since the previous morning, not in terms of grievance or protest, but in terms of practical consequence. I described the withdrawal of Earth's rare element mining contracts from Covenant-aligned distributors and the redirection of those contracts to independent buyers. I described the suspension of Earth's contribution to the Covenant's Shared Environmental Data Consortium, data that 12 species used for agricultural planning on their colony worlds. I described the activation of a communications infrastructure that I described only as Earth's own relay network, which I noted was operational and available for bilateral agreements with interested parties. I did not describe the full scale of the network. I did not need to. Vel Dorith's reaction to the phrase, Earth's own relay network, was visible enough, a very slight stillness, a fractional pause before his next breath, to tell me that his intelligence people had already been working through the night and had found more than they expected. Earth is not in a position to operate an independent relay network, Vel Dorith said, and I could hear the thing underneath those words. He was not stating a legal objection. He was making a claim about capability. About what humans could and could not do. I looked at him for a moment. We activated the first stage at 22:11 last night, I said. If you check the signal data from the past 14 hours, you will find it already running. The second stage comes online this evening. The chamber was quiet again. I would be happy to share the technical specifications, I said. Once we have a bilateral framework to share them within, since we no longer operate under the Covenant's information exchange protocols. I sipped my coffee. Vel Dorith called a recess. During the recess, 4 delegations approached me directly on the chamber floor. Not through aides, not through formal channels, they walked over. 2 were small species who had been marginal Covenant members for decades, consistently outvoted on any issue that affected their interests. 1 was a mid-sized civilization that had trade relationships with Earth that they clearly did not want disrupted. The 4th was a delegation I had not expected, the Selhari, who had abstained on the vote the day before and who were, in the Covenant's internal hierarchy, moderately influential. The Selhari ambassador was a woman named Voss, and she spoke quietly and directly. We abstained because we were not given adequate time to review the evidence, she said. If we had been, we would have voted against. I appreciate you telling me that, I said. The network you mentioned, she said. Is it actually operational? It is, I said. And you are offering bilateral access? To parties who are interested in a fair working relationship, I said. Yes. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read and probably meant to be. Earth has surprised us, she said. We tend to, I said. The recess ended. Vel Dorith returned to his chair and the session resumed, but it was not the same session it had been before the recess. The shape of the room had changed. I could not point to a single moment when it shifted. It was 100 small moments, 100 micro-adjustments in posture and attention, but the chamber that reconvened was one in which the Vethra's certainty had lost some of its weight. The formal censure motion failed. Not dramatically, it passed in a technical sense, but 3 delegations who had voted for Resolution 7 Alpha 9 the day before either abstained or voted against the censure. Vel Dorith noted the result in the flat voice of someone who has won the vote and lost the argument. I gathered my notebook and my thermos. Lynn and I walked out of the chamber the same way we had entered. No fanfare, no statement at the door. Just 2 people leaving a room. The corridor outside was the same pale stone, the same amber light. But something was different about walking through it this time. I noticed it in the way the few Covenant staffers we passed in the hall moved, a fraction more uncertain, a fraction less assured in the assumption that they knew who we were and what we meant. Outside, in the transit bay, Peter had sent 11 messages in the past 2 hours. I read them in order. By the fourth one, I was almost smiling. 6 independent species had formally requested meetings. The Keth had submitted a draft framework document for what they were calling an open economic compact. 3 Covenant member species had made public statements questioning the evidentiary basis of Resolution 7 Alpha 9. And George Adler had sent a single line: second stage is ahead of schedule. Tonight, not tomorrow. I looked at Lynn. She was already updating the meeting calendar. How many meetings? I said. 14 confirmed, 9 pending, she said. And the Selhari ambassador's office called while you were in session. What did they want? To know if you were free for dinner, Lynn said. I sat down in the shuttle. Earth was out the window again, blue and white, patient and full. I thought about Vel Dorith calling a recess. About the 4 delegations on the chamber floor. About the censure motion losing 3 votes it should have had. About Adler's second stage coming online tonight, ahead of schedule, because the people who built it had been ready for this moment longer than anyone outside that small room had known. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is a feeling that belongs to the end of things, and this was nowhere near the end. But I felt something. The motive was always greed. It usually is. And greed, when it finally shows its face clearly, has a way of making every other question easier to answer. We had work to do. We had meetings to take and frameworks to draft and a network to finish lighting up. We had 8 billion people behind us who were, if the feeds were any indication, ready for exactly the kind of next step we were about to take. I sipped the last of the coffee. It had gone cold, but I did not mind. The morning had been ours. The evening was going to be interesting. The Open Compact had no grand founding ceremony. I want to be clear about that because the stories that came later, the accounts written by historians and journalists and the various alien media networks that covered the period, tended to build it into something dramatic. A moment of declaration. A symbolic gathering of species united against oppression. It was not that. It was 41 days of very hard work conducted in a series of meeting rooms, shuttle bays, secure channels, and, on 3 memorable occasions, in transit lounges at orbital stations because scheduling 8 different species across 7 different time systems does not allow for much dignity of setting. I was present for most of it. Lynn and Peter were present for all of it. George Adler's team ran the technical infrastructure that made the communications possible. The Keth, specifically Tor Nevin and his deputy, a quiet and precise person named Alya, did more of the structural drafting than anyone outside the process ever fully understood. I am getting ahead of myself. On the day after the council session, which Adler's team had privately taken to calling the recess day, because the recess Vel Dorith called had done more damage to the Vethra's position than the actual vote had, the Covenant made its first serious attempt at a quiet resolution. It came through an informal channel, not Vel Dorith's office directly but through an intermediary, a Covenant administrative official named Parl who had always been technically neutral in internal politics. Parl contacted Lynn's personal channel at 7 in the morning. The council, Parl said carefully, is open to a discussion about the evidentiary review process for Resolution 7 Alpha 9. There is an understanding that the process may have moved more quickly than was ideal. Lynn brought me the message word for word. I read it twice. May have moved more quickly than was ideal, I said. Yes, Lynn said. They cut the microphone after 17 seconds, I said. Yes, Lynn said again, with the patience of someone who has learned that her role is sometimes to simply confirm that reality is as unreasonable as it appears. I dictated a response. Lynn cleaned up the grammar and sent it. It thanked Parl for the communication and noted that Earth's position remained as stated in our withdrawal notification. We were not pursuing a formal review of Resolution 7 Alpha 9 through Covenant processes. We wished Parl well. Parl did not respond. I understood. He had been sent to take a temperature reading, and the temperature was clear. What happened next happened fast, and I want to walk through it carefully because the speed is the point. 36 hours after the withdrawal announcement, the Luna Relay Station became an issue. The Luna Relay was a communications hub that Earth had built and maintained under a Covenant cooperative framework. Physically, it sat in lunar orbit. Legally, it had been classified as Covenant shared infrastructure, which the Vethra now argued meant it fell under Covenant jurisdiction regardless of Earth's withdrawal. Practically, it served as a signal relay for 31 species on the inner arm, routing faster-than-light communications through a node that Earth's technical teams kept running with a maintenance contract renewed annually. The Vethra sent a message informing us that a Covenant peacekeeping flotilla would be arriving to ensure the continued operation of the station under Covenant administration. I read the message at 3 in the morning. I called Adler. "How long has the relay been running on our maintenance contract?" I asked. "The team was rotated out 40 hours ago," Adler said. I paused. "You pulled the team?" "We pulled the team 36 hours ago," he said. "Right after the withdrawal. Skeleton crew only, non-essential systems in standby, data cores updated." I understood immediately. "What did you update them with?" "A message," Adler said. "In 140 languages." I almost laughed. "How long until the flotilla arrives?" "At standard approach speed, 18 hours. And our network second stage?" "Online 4 hours ago," he said. "Full coverage of the inner arm relay chain." I sat with this for a moment. The Vethra were sending a fleet to take control of a station that our team had already vacated, whose data cores now contained a message in every known language explaining that the station was private Earth property and the arriving vessels were trespassing, and whose relay function had already been made redundant by a network that had been quietly running for 6 years without anyone knowing it existed. "And the species who depend on the Luna relay for communication," I said. "Where are they routing now?" "Through our network," Adler said. "We sent them direct connection invitations 8 hours ago. 23 of the 31 accepted within the first 4 hours. And the other 8? 5 are evaluating. 3 went through Covenant channels to ask if there was an alternative. The Covenant told them to wait for the peacekeeping flotilla to establish administration of the Luna station. They then came back to us." I rubbed my eyes. "All 31 are on our network now. As of 40 minutes ago," Adler said, and I could hear the particular quiet of someone who has been working for 3 days without proper sleep and is running entirely on the satisfaction of watching something they built actually function as designed. "The peacekeeping flotilla arrived at the Luna relay 18 hours later. 42 vessels, which was a significant deployment for what was technically described as an administrative mission. They hailed the station on the Covenant Standard Channel. The station responded with the recorded message, in their language specifically, informing them that they were trespassing on Earth's private infrastructure and requesting that they identify their legal basis for approach. The flotilla did not advance. They held position for 6 hours, during which the Covenant's communication channels generated, according to Adler's monitoring systems, an extraordinary volume of internal traffic. They then requested a direct channel to Earth's diplomatic office. Lynn took the call. She was extremely polite. She noted that Earth was happy to discuss the Luna station's future, and that Earth's position was that it was private infrastructure, and that if the Covenant wished to discuss a lease arrangement for the station's continued operation as a relay node, Earth's office was available for that conversation. She suggested they file a formal request. She gave them a contact address. The flotilla held position for another 4 hours and then withdrew. I was told about it after the fact. I had been in my 4th meeting of the day by then, this one with the Selhari ambassador Voss, who had come to Nairobi in person, which was a significant gesture given that Selhari protocol strongly preferred remote communication for initial stage diplomacy. Voss was direct in person in a way that her brief conversation on the council floor had only hinted at. She sat across the table from me with the expression of someone reassessing a calculation they had made too quickly. "The genetic study," she said, "was wrong." "Yes," I said. "We knew it was questionable," she said, and this was a level of honesty that I had not quite expected. "We abstained because we did not want to vote against the Vethra on insufficient information. We thought the study was probably flawed, but we did not have confirmation." "You have confirmation now," I said. "Yes," a pause. "We should have sought it before the vote." "Yes," I agreed, without elaboration. She looked at me. "You are not going to make this easier, are you?" "I am going to make it honest," I said. "Which I think is actually easier, in the long run." We spent 3 hours going through the Open Compact framework document that the Keth had drafted. Voss had read it before coming, I had sent it ahead, and her comments were detailed and technically sophisticated. We agreed on 11 points and left 4 open. She took the open points back to her government. 2 days later, the Selhari became the 5th species to sign the Open Compact preliminary agreement. By the end of the first week, there were 9 signatories. By the end of the second week, 14. The Covenant, watching this unfold, made its second attempt at a resolution, this time more direct. A message came from Vel Dorotha's office to mine, personal and not through an intermediary. He wrote, in the careful language of someone who is offering something they do not want to offer, the Covenant was prepared to reopen the evidentiary review of Resolution 7 Alpha 9. A special committee would be formed. The reclassification would be suspended pending review. If Earth would pause its activities regarding what he called the parallel framework, the committee could have a preliminary result within 30 days. I read it 3 times. Then I took it to Eleanor Graves. She read it once. She put it down on the desk and looked at the window. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want to put it to the planet," I said. She looked at me. "Not the committee," I said. "Not the coalition governments. A global referendum. Let everyone decide." There was a long pause. "That has never been done," she said. "Most of what we've done this week has never been done," I said. Another pause. And then Eleanor Graves did what she had always done in every conversation I had ever had with her, which was arrive at the reasonable answer without needing to be convinced by anyone. "Set it up," she said. The referendum ran for 72 hours. Every adult human on Earth was eligible to vote. The question was a single sentence: should Earth re-enter the Galactic Covenant under any conditions that involve returning to the membership framework we withdrew from? The answer came back 71% no. The comments attached to the vote, which were optional and not binding, were, as Lynn put it in her summary, comprehensive in their variety and consistent in their direction. I sent Vel Dorith the result without commentary. He did not respond for 40 hours. When he did, the message was short. He asked if Earth was willing to discuss a different arrangement, not a reinstatement of the previous membership but a new kind of relationship, one that the Covenant had no existing framework for. I wrote back and said that we were open to that conversation, and that we would be happy to discuss it once the Open Compact had completed its founding session and established its own committee structure, at which point we would have a clearer picture of what relationships we were in a position to offer. I gave him a date. 3 weeks away. And then I went back to the meetings. There were 31 species at the Open Compact's founding session. Earth did not chair it. We had pushed hard on that point in the drafting process, and the Keth, to their credit, had understood why immediately. Tornevin proposed a rotating chair structure that would give every member equal time in the leadership position, weighted only by seniority of membership, with seniority measured from the date of signing, which meant that every species who had signed in those first weeks was equally new. Nobody argued with that. I sat in the third row at the founding session, not at the front, not at the podium. Lynn sat beside me with her document pad. Peter, who had not slept more than 5 hours in any of the past 20 days, sat on my other side and was visibly trying to stay focused and mostly succeeding. The founding document was read aloud in 6 languages, then filed. A vote was called to formally establish the compact as a functioning body. It passed unanimously. There was a brief, quiet moment after that. Not applause. The species present had varying relationships with the concept of applause, and we had agreed early in the process to avoid gestures that carried different meanings across cultures. Just silence. The particular kind of silence that follows something that has been completed. I looked around the room. 31 delegations. Small species and mid-sized ones, some old and some newer, some who had been in the Covenant for centuries and some who had never managed to qualify for membership in the first place. None of them famous. None of them powerful in the way the Vethera were powerful. All of them here because something had gone wrong in a chamber on a station, and the response to that wrong had opened a door they had not expected to find. The 3 Vethera executives whose companies had commissioned the fabricated genetic study were identified 3 weeks after the founding session. It was not Earth that identified them, it was the Vethera's own internal review body, which had apparently been under considerable pressure from other Vethera member worlds who were tired of being associated with what had become a significant public embarrassment. The executives were handed over to the independent tribunal that the Open Compact had established for exactly this kind of cross-species accountability case. I was asked, by a journalist from one of the independent alien media networks, whether I felt that this represented justice. It represents a start, I said. The Luna relay station, as it turned out, was genuinely useful to several species even after our own network was fully operational, because the Luna network had a different coverage range and served different nodes. We eventually negotiated a lease arrangement with 7 species directly, bypassing the Covenant entirely, under which Earth maintained the station and the lessees paid in a combination of rare materials and scientific data. The arrangement was, on paper, quite favorable to Earth. The species involved agreed to it because the alternative was going back to a Covenant-administered system that had just demonstrated it was not as reliable as they had assumed. Vel Dorith and I met in person, finally, 6 weeks after the founding session. Not in the Covenant chamber. At a neutral station run by a small species that belonged to neither the Covenant nor the Open Compact and was therefore acceptable to both parties. He was taller than he appeared on screen. Most beings are shorter than they appear on screen. Vel Dorith was an exception. He sat across from me with the posture of someone who had spent a long time being the most powerful person in any given room and was adjusting, with some difficulty, to a room where that was no longer straightforwardly true. "I misjudged you," he said. "You misjudged Earth," I said. "I misjudged Earth," he agreed. We talked for 3 hours. Not about grievances. I had genuinely no interest in performing grievance for Vel Dorith's benefit, and I sense he had no interest in performing apology. We talked about what a working relationship between the Covenant and the Open Compact might actually look like. What each side had that the other needed. Where the interests aligned and where they did not. It was, in the end, a conversation that resembled diplomacy more than anything that had happened in the council chamber on the day of the vote. Which was, I reflected, something worth noting. I flew back to Nairobi 2 days later. It was raining, which Nairobi does with a particular enthusiasm in that season. Lynn had arranged 17 messages in order of priority for me to review. Peter had taken a week of leave and had sent me a photograph of himself on a beach somewhere, looking like a person who had recently remembered that sleep is a thing that exists. I sat in my office and looked at the rain on the window for a while. I thought about the 40 seconds. The dead microphone. The laughter moving through the chamber like a slow wave. The dark badge. The corridor with the amber lights. The shuttle and Earth through the viewport and the 2 words I wrote in my notebook. I thought about 41 days of meetings and 3 weeks of referendum and a founding session that had passed unanimously and a lease arrangement for a relay station and Vel Dorith saying I misjudged Earth with the slight adjustment of someone recalibrating under pressure. I thought about what George Adler's team had built, quietly, over 6 years. What Eleanor Graves had authorized without drama. What Lynn and Peter had kept running through 3 weeks of no sleep and impossible volume. What Tor Nevin and Alia had drafted with more care than anyone outside the room would ever see. What 31 species had signed their names to in a session that had no ceremony and did not need one. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something more durable than triumph. Something that does not go away when the moment ends. They humiliated Earth before the council. They cut the microphone at 17 seconds. They passed the resolution and went home expecting to find us filing paperwork. By morning, every treaty was gone. And in the space that opened up where the treaties had been, we built something they had not imagined, with people they had not considered, through methods they had not credited us with possessing. That is what 8 billion people can do when you tell them no. That is what happens when you silence someone who had not yet said the important thing. The important thing, it turned out, was not a speech. It was everything that came after.